Welcome to Hints and Guesses, my podcast. Kent here. Thanks for tuning in. I want to begin with an obscure line from the book of Deuteronomy, from the Torah, from the Hebrew Bible. It says, "My father was a wandering Aramean." Now, this is in reference to Abraham, and it might sound like obscure and kind of a strange way of referring to Abraham, and you'd think that it would be passed right over, but it's a powerful line. It's a potent line. It's so important, in fact, that the core of what's called the Haggadah, which is the liturgy said by Jewish people during Passover, contains this passage. At the very part of the Haggadah, when the children ask, or the parents ask, I can't remember which, what makes this night different than any other? Speaking of the Passover, speaking of the story of Exodus, speaking of this particular holiday that comes back round once a year, part of the answer to that question begins with, "My father was a wandering Aramean." So it's an extremely important clue here. Not only about, in a sense, what it means to be Jewish, which that's certainly true, but I might expand out from there, like, what does it mean to be a human being on this earth? What does it mean to be a human being in relationship to God and the world? And what is the nature of the spiritual life, our actual life? What's it really like? And kind of amazingly, the image is one of a wanderer. That you could even say the entire biblical story is a kind of wander. This is something that I've been thinking about and wondering about for a long time. You know, sometimes all of the energy is taken up when it comes to the Bible, arguing about whether or not it's true and what we mean by that. And what most people mean is whether or not it's historical, or did it really come from God? And sometimes we forget to ask, what kind of story is it? And here we can be direct. It's the story of an immense wander. It's a story of leaving a certain mode of being, a way of life, a father, a mother, a household, a country, and setting off toward the unknown, toward a place not yet even imagined. Go to a land I will show you, is what Yahweh says to Abram and Sarai, as they're first called in the Torah. You don't even know where you're going. Now that's a very surprising way to begin a story that lasts generations and centuries. And in a way, the entire biblical story, and I'll include even the New Testament, is one long, massive wander. A kind of seeking, and there's a kind of repeated pattern of wandering and searching and arriving and leaving and wandering and searching and arriving and being kicked out and wandering and searching and arriving and being thrown out and wandering and searching and arriving. And who's searching for who? Is God searching for human beings? That's that haunting and lovely line from Abraham Heschel in the title of one of his books, God in Search of Man, God in Search of Human Beings. As if God is wandering. In fact, that's the very first thing we see the divine doing after Adam and Eve are driven from Eden and are wandering around themselves. It says, and Yahweh was wandering, it might say Elohim, was wandering in the garden. in the cool of the day, looking for them. And also, it's a setting out of the human being, of the spirit of the human being, to seek the transcendent, to seek God, to seek a center, to seek the source, to seek a home, like the home beyond homes, the center beyond centers. My father was a wandering Aramean. To claim such a line, to let it roll around in your mouth and in your heart, is to join our spiritual ancestors. And to be a participant in the unfolding discovery of what a relationship with God might look like, what it might grow into. We wander with our ancestors here. And if I can be even more direct, that's why the Bible, I think, is still so important. And I've been thinking about this and avoiding this. I've been avoiding this podcast in a way for a long time because it's not cool to like the Bible, really. Or if you do like the Bible, you're kind of a nerd. But I do. I really love the text. And that's not to say it doesn't give me trouble. Of course, it gives me a ton of trouble. I have broken up and gotten back together with the Bible dozens of times. I've gone through seasons of intense reading and trust and following and opening my heart, and then also closing my heart, and huge parts of my life I was committed to historical criticism and to the science, in a way, of studying the Bible and picking apart the verses and understanding the context and the language and the nuance and studying archaeology and amassing data that either confirms or denies the text. And I've spent 20 years of my life taking people to Israel, in part because I love the Bible and also because it gives me trouble. And even when I stepped down from being a pastor, I really felt like I was passing through something and into a kind of unknown terrain, and I shed all kinds of things. It felt like the right thing to do. And I sold my entire library of Bible-related books. I kept a couple, which I had been collecting for a long time, and I regretted it. I regretted it almost right away. I tried to buy them back. I bought 5 of them back. And yeah, I feel like, and that also felt right. Like, okay, I can't exactly go back. And so I'm just saying the Bible gives me trouble, and I grew up with the Bible, like I could say crammed down my throat, but I didn't actually feel that way. I've said that line before, the Bible was crammed down my throat, but in some ways it was just like the water I was swimming in, we were all swimming in. I was a fundamentalist Baptist. Baptists actually love the Bible. It's not like they're, the Bible thumping, preacher gets a bad rap, but at least the Baptists I've been around, there's a love affair with it. And there's a sense of knowing and feeling and its own sacredness and treating it with a lot of respect. And so I was absolutely inundated. We went to church Wednesday night, Sunday morning, Sunday night. For a while when I was a kid, I went to a Christian school, so Bible verses plastered on the wall, memorization. It was even used as punishment in our home. I was like a kind of a naughty kid, I guess, and I'd have to write out Bible verses, Maybe that was even the beginning of like my love-hate relationship. Like, really, I'm copying this book this verse from Proverbs like 50 times is going to keep me from lying. Well, I don't know, maybe. But it went in deep. That's what I would say. In fact, when I got to graduate school, I was surprised. This is kind of like, I'm not trying to do a little flex here, but even with my professors, I felt like at least at times I knew the Bible better than they did. And not because I was an expert in language or, it was just exposure. It was saturation. I'd say, well, I actually, we'd be in the middle of studying something and I'd say, well, also a couple verses later, it says this. And they're like, well, how'd you know that? I was like, not because I was trying. So I'm really grateful for that. And maybe it's taken me a long time to even feel gratitude for the way in which the Bible went in deep. But it still, I just want to say, gives me trouble. Even as a parent, I was unsure. I didn't want the Bible to be heavy-handed for my kids. I remember a couple stories. One of my kids in Israel, on an Israel trip, was like, "Dad, I didn't know you knew this stuff." And I kind of laughed, but inside I felt a little ashamed. I was like, "Wait a minute. What exactly am I? It's like my kids need to be protected from the Bible, And I do believe in their soul, that they'll find their way. But something that mattered to me, I kind of held at arm's length in a way, and I didn't want to. I was just reactive from the fundamentalist background I came from, and it's like, I guess I can let myself off the hook a little bit. One of my kids, even the other day, said. I said, it's like David and Goliath. And they said, who? And I was like, oh, there it is again. And, And so where am I going here? I want to go deeper into this notion of wandering through the Bible. And I want to experiment with a few podcasts that have this as the orientation. And whether you like the Bible or not, rejected the Bible, believe the Bible, I still want to invite you along. I mean, let's walk together and see what happens. And I'm kind of excited about this because, to my surprise, these stories have come back round again in my life. And maybe it is kind of like circling the mountain, and you come back round to the same, or it's a spiral maybe, and you come back around again, and it's like, oh, that's what that was about. And even my rejection and my turning away and my turning my face, kind of like the figure of Jonah who just wants to run away as far as possible, is also part of the story. And you find yourself swallowed and spit back on the shore. And there you are again. And that's what it's been like for me. Even when I was in, a few years ago, going through one of the more strange and difficult time periods of my life, after I'd left being a pastor and my dad died of ALS, and I was getting more involved in animist work, and dreams and an inner life was really a country I hadn't visited. And I was surprised that instead of leaving the Bible, it's like I had walked into the subterranean world in which the Bible was born. And I was like, oh, that's what it's like. And now I know a little of what it's like to wrestle with God or with the angel and walk away with a limp, just a little bit. I know that. I know what it's like to betray Jesus, to deny that I ever even knew Jesus, like Peter, or to betray him for some money. Yeah, I know that inside. It's like, oh, these stories are way richer, way more profound. And they're not just personal. They're also, in my opinion, part of what has shaped the Western and modern mind, for better or worse. It's like it's in there. The stories are in there. The patterns are in there. The shapes are in there. And instead of thinking like we just graduated and moved on, I think actually probably what's needed is to listen again. Listen with new ears to look again and see with new eyes, to admit the things that have shaped us for better and for worse, and to see what whispers from our ancestors, what whispers of wisdom are still alive. And in fact, that is, at least from the writers of the New Testament, that was their conception of. You probably heard the line, all scripture is God-breathed. And of course, they were referring to the Torah because the New Testament hadn't been collected yet. It was in the process of being written, like Paul and Peter and, even the gospel writers. It's not like they thought, oh man, I'm writing the New Testament. I hope I get in. No, when they said all scripture is God-breathed, they really meant the Hebrew Bible. And that image of breath is taken straight from Genesis, and God breathed into the human mouth, the human nostrils, and all human beings and all of life contain the breath of the divine. And they're saying, and that's also like the scripture, it's alive. For the scripture to be God breathed means it's a living thing. It's animated by the mysteries, by God, by the Spirit, by the wind. And is that a matter of faith or belief? I don't know. Maybe to a certain extent, I trust that that's the case. But for me, I found out from the inside, I can feel them living. I can feel the patterns and the symbols and the truths alive. I bump into them in my own life. And I can see and feel the way in which the living essence of the scriptures is alive in the world. Our cries for justice echo the voices of the prophets. Our laments are mirrored by the psalmist. Our love affairs are mirrored back in the Song of Songs. Yeah, and I could just go on and on. And most importantly, our own sense of wandering, to be a human being is to be a wanderer. There's not even a people group ever that has stayed put. Human beings are wanderers, and the Bible says, and this is what it's like. Here's a picture of what that's like, what that wandering is like, collected up in poems and stories and historical writing and about 7 different genres of ancient literature. And it's a little like this. And to turn our attention is to drink from a deep well, in my view. And I want to drink from that deep well, and that's what I'm doing. I'm trying to do in my own small way. And so I want to invite you on a wander, really. And I have a couple ways I'd like to do that over the next few weeks. But before we dive in, I want to say something obvious, which is human beings live by story or by stories. And whether or not we're conscious of that story is quite another question. And you can reject the biblical stories if you want. It's hard to reject the patterns that are in them, but you could say something like, well, they're not important to me. And you'd still be left with the question of what kind of story am I living in? What kind of story am I inhabiting? And so that leads me to sort of another line of thought, which is maybe the form of a question. What kind of story is the biblical narrative? And I want to be general, not specific. In other words, if we wander through the Bible, what are we likely to encounter? And what I want to emphasize right now is that in the broadest possible sense, it's a story of transformation. And even the individual characters, what makes their stories powerful is that they change, they transform, they change forms, they grow. It's not a static story. It's exile and return. It's death and resurrection. It's the changing of forms. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why the Bible has gone in deep. Or you could even say the other way around. The stories that are in the Bible reveal a deep pattern that is one expression of the core of what it means to be human. What does it look like to change form, to be shaped by the world, to be shaped by God, to be shaped by mystery, to be shaped by life, and to be a participant, to do our own small co-creative work in making the world, I could just leave it at that, in making the world. And maybe a subtext of that is people don't tend to change all that easily. The stories are fraught with tension and missteps and breakthroughs, or breakthroughs and breakdowns. And that's a natural part of the human story, a natural part of the human condition. So when we wander through the Bible, we're wandering through stories of transformation. Even our understanding of God is being transformed. It's changing form. God, believe it or not, if I can back way up, I'm not making a definitive dogmatic claim, but if we look at the Bible, it's like more and more of God is revealed and concealed. God is not static, or you could say that the human understanding of the divine changes, transforms as humans transform. And of course, that's the essence of the story of Jesus, a life transformed, which then spills out into the world in a new way, which those early Christians really didn't even think of as a religion, but as an experience, a personal and collective experience that was breaking forth and spreading like fire through their hearts. So here's what I want to do. I want to back up to COVID. COVID was an apocalyptic time, and in some ways we're still in it. The global nature, the transcontinental nature of this illness really put pressure on what we consider important, on our values, on our beliefs, on our ideas, on our relationships, on our conception of the world, on our conceptions of what was safe and unsafe. It's an apocalyptic time, meaning specifically it's a revealing time. That's what apocalypse actually means, as you probably know. I've said it before here. It means to reveal. And always the question is, what is being revealed? And it felt like a revelatory time for me. It's like, even some of my truer, at least it seemed that way, political dispositions kind of came out of hiding. Oh, that's interesting. My kind of gut reaction to this or that. Where did that come from? It doesn't fit with my persona, say, or how I'd like to be seen. And so it's revealing on the personal level and, of course, on the social level. And for me, one of the things that surprised me was I just kept seeing and hearing the words of Jesus and his life and because it was set in such an apocalyptic time, the first century, where you had immense Roman pressure on the very eastern edge of the Roman Empire in a tiny little place called Judea. And the entire cultural climate was like a volcano that was about to erupt around politics and religion and God and divinity and Caesar. You know, you had the birth of Caesar, who claimed to be the Son of God, and when he died, ascended to the right hand of God and promised peace on earth, Pax Romana. And okay, what a time to be born into, and that's the world in which Jesus finds himself, and the collision with the empire. And of course, that led to his death. But that was just the beginning of the Jesus movement, the Jesus story, that then began to spread out from Judea, being met with the fiery Roman Empire at every turn. Even Vesuvius, the ancient volcano, erupts about the time the Gospels are being written and the book of Revelation is being written. And it was a revealing time. What's in your heart? What's in your heart? What's true? What kingdoms are operative? Is there a God, really? And how and what would it look like to be in relationship? So anyway, the Jesus story kept coming back to me. So I made a kind of deal, which I thought I wouldn't have to keep with my patrons. I said, if I get 50 patrons, I'll record an audio book, which I called later A Grain of Wheat, from this enigmatic saying of Jesus, and I'll release it for free for my patrons. I also put it on my website for anyone who wanted to buy it, the audiobook. And I got 50 patrons. I was like, oh, and it all came out in a flood. Just like, I just sat down one day and recorded, and 7 hours later, or something like that, I had a kind of audiobook. I didn't edit it. It's not super well crafted, but it really was, at least when the story of Jesus was an example of me coming back around the mountain again. Okay, what would I say now? What am I hearing now? What am I seeing now? What's resonant now? And I sort of started to imagine Jesus as a kind of symbol, like the Christ symbol, and I saw his life in I would say stages. That's what the audiobook is based on, these 7 stages. Of course, not limited to that, but that was the pattern that came out, and I really enjoyed it. And so it's kind of gone on the back burner. But as I've been thinking about kind of diving back into the Bible, wandering through the Bible, I returned to that audiobook. I was like, oh, I wonder what I said. And I was particularly curious about the beginning, because right at the beginning of that audiobook, I talk about what is a symbol and what I call the 3 chords of listening to the biblical stories, which is story, context, and symbol. And then I get into the different Jesuses, what I call the changing faces of Jesus. And then I go through these 7 stages. And I don't know, it occurred to me, all right, this was my first attempt. Why not just release it here? Release it for free on the podcast for everybody, not just my patrons, and maybe break it up a little bit. So that's what I intend to do. I want to release this audio book. I'll make an intro for each one, because I'm going to listen to it, and I might say something slightly different, or maybe I'll make an outro too. I'm not sure. I'll have to see how it goes. But the reason why is because this is my first attempt at really wandering through the Bible again, and specifically the life of Jesus, and what I like to call Christ as symbol. And so you can get a flavor for what I'm up to, and I'd love to know what you think. I mean, listen to it. Obviously, I'm inviting you to listen to it, and but send me feedback. Send me a message through my website. If you're a patron, comment. What are you hearing? What are you seeing? What are you thinking? And I'll let this attempt at what I was calling kind of experimental audiobook, out into the wider world, the podcast here, and see what happens. And in the meantime, I'll start thinking, what other stories might I want to wrestle with or wander through, as I occasionally turn my attention to this dimension of the podcast, which I'm calling wandering through the Bible. So anyway, that's the first thing I'm going to do. Release this audiobook. I might as well put out a challenge, because last one I thought was ridiculous. I thought if I get 50 patrons, I'll make an audiobook. So I'm going to make up an even bigger number. If I get 200 patrons, which seems outrageous, then I'll release really another version of this Christ as symbol, which I'd like to call the Wild Galilean. This is something that won't leave me alone, like the Wild Galilean. And I want to look at a whole bunch of other dimensions of the life of Jesus that have struck me recently as I'm coming back around the mountain, and in a way being confronted. So, okay, that's the promise. Now, that's a super long 30-minute intro. So, I feel also it's important. If you made it this far, I want to tell you what I'm up to. Then we'll turn our we'll turn our attention to the beginning of this A Grain of Wheat audiobook. So, all right, here are things. January 19, which is coming up, I've got prayers and practices for the new year. 4 sessions. We meet online every other week, 4 times. It's quite an affordable group compared to some of my other online groups and in-person stuff. So I wanted to make something that was quite affordable. Let's look at some practices and some prayers that we can try out. We'll try them out together. I'm a participant in this with you. And so each week we'll look at kind of a different category of practices, and we'll talk a bit about them. And then over the course of those 2 weeks in between, we'll do them. So would love to have you join. It'd be great to meet some of you. People are already signing up, so encourage you to do it right away so that it doesn't fill up. Well, I hope it fills up, but I just mean if you want in, do it right away. Okay, I'm also offering a dream work course for the Dominican Center. It's 2 evenings, February 21 and 22. It's called Dreams in the Spiritual Life. So if dreams interest you and you live somewhere near Grand Rapids, grdominicans.org is their website. Go there. You can find this offering and would love to see you there. I have a bunch of Animist things. I have an online program called Nature and the Human Soul. It's full right now, but we just decided to open up a few more spots. That starts January 22nd, also goes once a week for a while. And Nature and the Human Soul is based on the book of the same name, Bill Plotkin's book. It's really the core model that we use at Animist. So if that interests you, would love to see you there. I've got a Soulcraft Intensive, which is a 5-day program, kind of a deep dive / intro to nature-based work in Vermont, May 24 through 28. And then another Soulcraft Intensive in June in Colorado, not too far from Telluride. That's June 23rd or something, 25 maybe. All that information, animist.org, or you can Google Animist Valley Institute. And that's all I want to advertise right now. Of course, if you want to become a patron, patreon.com/Kent Dobson. Would love to have more patrons. Your support is needed now more than ever in my life, especially in this kind of in-between time that I'm living through. Okay. Here's what you're about to hear. A few thoughts on symbol and a few thoughts on this braid, this cord of the Bible, of how to listen to the Bible, story, context, and symbol. I hope you enjoy. I hope you hear something. I hope you hear a hint, a guess, a clue. If you're a patron and you took advantage of listening to it before, when I made it available for free, maybe you'll hear something new. That would be interesting. And let me know. So, yeah, with that said, wishing you well. Thanks for being a part of this community. All right, let me begin with a quotation from Carl Jung. And here it is. It is only possible to live the fullest life when we are in harmony with these symbols. It is only possible to live the fullest life when we are in harmony with these symbols. Wisdom is a return to them, the symbols. It is a question neither of belief nor of knowledge, but of the agreement of our thinking with the primordial images of the unconscious. Something like a kind of terrain exists in the psyche. And when I say psyche, I mean it in the traditional sense of soul. That's where we get the word soul. Soul is a translation of the word psyche in Greek. There's something about the map, the underground terrain of who we think we are, that is informed by these primordial images, by the great symbols, the greatest symbols that humanity has ever come in contact with, like the cosmic tree, like the Great Mother, like death and resurrection. The great archetypal patterns exist already in our unconscious, already in the underworld of who we are. And to align our thinking, maybe thinking isn't even the right word for it, but that's what Jung says here. To align our way of being is to realign with wisdom, it's to realign with meaning. And we can only live the fullest life when we are in harmony with the great symbols. That's the challenge. That's what I hear in this quotation, a kind of challenge. How do you want to align your life? How do you want to align your life? With Twitter, which I like, it's fun. With CNN, with Fox News, with pundits, with political opinions, with ideologies, with doctrinal statements. How do you want to align your life? To align your life with the great symbols is to tap into a kind of energy source, a kind of welling up that is eternal and transcendent and larger than you and I could ever imagine our small lives to be. So what's at stake? What's at stake is a life of meaning. That's, by the way, all I mean by a religious person. I know people like to say I'm spiritual but not religious, and they often mean I don't adhere to religious doctrines. Okay, fine. But when I say I'm religious, I mean it in that my life is oriented toward meaning, recovering, discovering, wrestling with, being taken over by meaning that transcends my own egoic smallness. In that sense, I'm very religious. And I wanted to start with this kind of quotation just to set the stage, because I want to talk about Jesus, and I want to talk about Jesus as a symbol. And here's another line from Jung. He says, a symbol is the best possible expression for a complex fact not yet apprehended by consciousness. So I'm going to try that again. A symbol is the best possible expression for a complex fact not yet clearly apprehended by consciousness. In other words, our consciousness, our ego, the tip of the iceberg here, who we think we are and how we think the world works, our consciousness, when we encounter a symbol, when our ego, when our consciousness encounters a symbol, like Saint Francis kneeling before a broken cross in a crumbling chapel. He encounters a symbol. And it's all of a sudden, it's like that symbol cracks something open that we didn't know was there before. A whole terrain, a whole labyrinth that is both frightening, and also we have a sense that meaning rests here somewhere in the fog beyond the edges of where I can see. And a symbol, again, is the best possible expression for a complex fact. In other words, there is a complex fact back in there somewhere, which maybe we'll never get to the bottom of. But it bursts into our awareness for a moment. And I think about the Jesus symbol like that. Have you ever wondered, why doesn't the whole Christianity thing just go away? And maybe you think, well, it probably is in places like Europe. And I think, well, no, I don't think so. I remember when the cathedral in France, in Paris, was on fire, and the whole world was concerned about this. And I thought, what is this? Now you could say, well, they're just worried about architecture and tourism. And no, the unconscious, the labyrinth had been tapped for a moment, and our symbols were on fire. And the whole world suddenly wanted to turn toward meaning, or the question of meaning. What does this place mean to us? What does a cathedral mean to us? What is the Christ symbol in the center of this cathedral? What is it? What power, what meaning is still there? Even in a world where Christianity, in many respects has lost its own plot. It's gone off the rails. It's bowing down before idols and ideologies. And it's become a kind of tribal fundamentalist camp on the right and the left, So I want to begin this with just a conversation around symbol itself. First of all, the title of this experimental audiobook. That's what this is. And maybe I should take a small break and thank my Patreon supporters. First of all, they make my podcast happen, Hints and Guesses, every single week. I cannot thank you enough. I really, really, really appreciate it. And also, I promised if I got over 50, I'd make an audiobook about the transformative pattern of Jesus or the symbol of Christ, or, fill in the blank. I could say about 7 other things right now. So I'm trying to fulfill that. And it's a challenge. I have been thinking about Jesus, about the symbol of Jesus, about the Christ symbol for a long time. I've been writing about it. And I thought originally what the content of this audiobook would be just a regular book. But I started writing another one, which tentatively is about the sign of Jonah, but it's related in any respect. So I kind of set some of the Christ stuff aside, thinking I wouldn't get 50 pages anyway. But here I am. And because of that commitment, I want to sit down and begin a conversation. And I want to invite you to treat this audiobook like a conversation, in the sense of whatever I say, whatever I point to, whatever image resonates or you're repulsed by or you want to fight, let's just treat it like a conversation. After all, obviously, I don't have the final word on Jesus. Christ is a symbol of an expression for a complex fact not yet clearly apprehended by consciousness. So I have not clearly apprehended. And so I want to play with and speak with and wrestle with Christ as symbol. And I hope you hear something in here that is provocative. But be warned, at the very heart of what I'm calling the Christ symbol is the path of transformation. It's a radical death and a resurrection of who we think we are. So we're playing with fire, if you want to put it that way. And be forewarned. Should you be vulnerable enough to open up your heart, as I'm attempting to do in my own way, to this complex fact not yet apprehended by consciousness? How might the Christ symbol upend my own life? So I was about to give you the title of the audiobook. It's called A Grain of Wheat. And maybe the subtitle is The Christ Symbol. A Grain of Wheat, the Christ Symbol. And maybe you've heard this line from Jesus, and if not, you should hear it. He says, unless a grain of wheat dies and goes into the ground, it remains a single seed. Unless a grain of wheat dies and goes into the ground, it remains a single seed. But if it goes into the ground, it reaps 100-fold. This, of course, is one of Jesus's enigmatic, rich, Kohen-like teachings. What is he talking about? Unless a grain of wheat dies. I mean, he's tapping into a symbol, which is bottomless. It's not just a metaphor. Metaphor is, it's like this. And I agree, there's a metaphoric aspect to it. But the symbol, brings us to the edge of a cliff. What is in this? That's true. That's ultimately true. That's true in the world, in nature, in the cosmos, and in the human heart, and in the human soul. What's true here? And I think what's true is that the path of transformation is about death and resurrection. He's not saying, Jesus, he's not saying, hey, I'm going to die and resurrect. Although he's saying, I'm going to die and resurrect. He might actually also be saying, presently, as I'm speaking to you, I am dying and resurrecting. He's not just saying that because you could file it away. Oh, he's predicting something that will come true with his own death and resurrection. And then therefore you get to file it into a theological, camp. As if Jesus is just going around trying to, prove points, make points and then make them come true. I think not. He's saying the pattern is true. And more than that, he's saying if you want to know what this way of being is like and how it might involve you, he's more or less looking you and I in the face and saying, unless you die and go into the ground, you'll remain just a single seed. It's possible to go through this life and not live your spiritual potential. That's kind of like, that's not, everybody's a hero. Everybody gets a special button. There are no losers, kind of culture. He's saying you can go to your grave, and the people who throw dirt on top of your coffin will know. They won't admit it, but they'll know this person didn't live into their spiritual potential. And who wants to live that way? Is that what you want to put on your tombstone? I refuse to change. I never grew up. I never transformed. I never changed. I remained the same. No. Another maybe a clue in this teaching of Jesus. Unless a grain of wheat dies and goes into the ground, it remains a single seed. But if it goes into the ground, it reaps 100-fold. It's not just, I sort of died to my old life. That's a Pauline language. I died to my old life and I'm being resurrected into a new life. And yay, it's that the new life reaps 100-fold. It spills out all over the place. It transforms your family, your relationships, your life, your vocation, your world, the earth, the cosmos. You cannot even imagine the rings in the pond. That's what Jesus is saying. He's saying that's true of his own life, and he's saying that's true of your life. But none of us want to change that easily. We don't know why. It's just part of the human makeup. It's very hard to grow up, as you know. It's very hard to develop coping strategies and survival strategies and a persona that people recognize, like persona means mask. And it's very hard. And it's becoming increasingly so. I mean, think about all our young people, our kids are having such a hard time. Especially since the kind of guardrails of culture have come off, meaning some kind of uniform agreement about morality and laws and wisdom and tradition, and they've come off. And so it's a very destabilizing environment. So it's really hard to grow up. And if you grow up and you can even maintain a job and some kind of like healthy relationship with a significant other or whatever, it's just hard to make it to that point. How much more once having reached that kind of plateau, you realize that's exactly what it is, a kind of plateau. And on the other side of the plateau is a whole nother canyon that you're about to tumble down into. And who you think you are and the way you think the world works is going into the ground and going into the grave and going into the tomb and going into the womb to be worked by mystery and be transformed. Who would want that? Like sometimes I think about Paul. St. Paul, that is. And there he is, he'd made it. Like, he's a great scholar, he's well known, he's in Jerusalem. The teachers of the law, like the bigwigs, the academics, are saying, hey, you can be our spokesperson, go hunt down these Christians and set them straight. And he had made it, made a name for himself and was respected. And yet, out on a walk one day, he's blinded by a light and blinded by the Christ symbol, we could say, which utterly flattens him. It's not like, oh, I was so enlightened and Jesus told me this and now my life is all better. No, it totally flattens him. It blinds him for 3 days. How's that for a symbol itself? And he's led by the hand. He can't even walk himself anywhere. He's led by a way he knows nothing about. And more than that, if you do the math, I think I put this in my book, Bitten by a Camel, but if you do the math, it takes him something like 15 years approximately before he ever begins to talk about it and to teach and to preach and to go around and to tell what it's like to be him. So the transformation process is not some instant fix. It's not a pill in our pill-popping culture. It's not a weekend retreat, even though I lead them. You should come on one. But it will not transform you. Transformation is like a dying and a going into the ground. It's an organic process that takes time and water and rain and soil and wind and nutrients, and it takes time. So There's nowhere to go. There's no rush. To be confronted by the Christ symbol is to begin a process. And I'd like to say, I mean, you can disagree, but I think many people who claim to be Christians, and I maybe, I guess we'd have to drill down and ask, what do you mean by that? But let's just keep it kind of ambiguous for a second. I think many people who claim to be Christians don't want to be confronted by Christ, not the symbol of death and resurrection. They don't want to die and be transformed. No one does. That's my point. And by no one, I mean the ego, who we think we are, the thing that we've worked so hard. We don't want to be transformed. So we'd rather believe statements about Jesus and remain in a camp than be confronted by a blinding light.